Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
India is going to have a pretty hot winter and summer next year on its borders, and we have to be prepared for that, not just in Eastern Ladakh, but across the entire stretch of the line of actual control between our two countries.
I'm with Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, India's former ambassador to China from 2017 to 2018 and previously in Pakistan, and Ananth Krishnan, the Hindu newspaper's correspondent in China. Today, I'm connecting the time zones. Ananth is in Hong Kong and Ambassador Bambawale is in Pune and I'm in New Delhi. And today we're discussing the importance of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, his place in history, and especially what he means for India, and all this in the wake of the Chinese Communist Party's plenum, which concluded on Thursday evening, a closed-door meeting, which consolidated President Xi's place in history, at least in Chinese history, and put him right there up close and personal with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Ambassador Bambawale and Ananth Krishnan, welcome to the Print Debates.
Thank you.
Ambassador Bambawale, may I start with you? You've been in China not that long ago. Your take on what this means, the consolidation of Xi Jinping, and put him right alongside the pantheon of the Chinese gods, Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong.
Absolutely, Jyoti, what you're saying and what you just described is absolutely correct. The 6th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee, which just got over, as we heard, it started on Monday and got over on Thursday. Earlier today, there was a press conference by the Central Committee or people who represented the Central Committee. It was a very important plenary session because there was a history resolution which was passed at this particular plenary session. There have only been 3 such history resolutions, one in 1945, one in 1981, and now in 2021. But let me say this, that there is no doubt that Xi Jinping has further consolidated his hold over the party and thereby over China itself. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. But this is not the end of history. History will actually judge, and the Communist Party itself will judge Xi Jinping, say 40 years from now or 25 years from now, based on what he has been able to achieve for his people. And there are questions. There are 2 main areas in which he will have to produce results. The first is, of course, there is an economic slowdown currently on in China. Whether he is able to overcome that and deliver continually rising living standards to his people, that's point number 1. And point number 2, where both Mao and Deng, 2 of the other leaders with whom he is being compared, they did something very important as far as the unification and the reunification of China was concerned. Mm-hmm. In Mao's period, of course, he won as the head of the Communist Party. He won the civil war, established the government of the People's Republic of China in the Communist Party. He ensured that far-flung areas like Xinjiang and Tibet were brought into the fold of the People's Republic. And in Deng, of course, we know that he reunified Hong Kong and Macau. So unfortunately, one of the pressure points for Xi is going to be the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. And there, I believe that as long as Xi consolidates his power, there is a higher probability of some kind of military action vis-a-vis Taiwan. I'll stop there, Jyoti.
Yeah. Ananth, you're in Hong Kong, considered, it's described as a special administrative zone of China. Now, what are people around you saying, not just the Chinese media, but what are the people of Hong Kong saying, especially because Hong Kong has traditionally been sort of voting in favor of the progressives and sort of the more liberal leadership in China? What are people saying?
Well, Jyoti, the first thing is, for me on a personal level, since I just got here, and it's exactly 2 years to the month that I left Hong Kong. And for me, it's quite striking that it's a kind of unrecognizable to the city that I was living in the second half of 2019. And the big reason for that was the passing of the national security law in 2020, which essentially brought Hong Kong very much directly under the control of Beijing. And in the view of most people here in Hong Kong, kind of redefine what one country, two systems is actually about, now that Beijing is actually directly legislating for Hong Kong, which never really happened before. And for me, even on another very surreal personal level, people that I had met in 2019 or interviewed, many of them are now behind bars, or they have given up politics. So essentially, the whole sort of pro-democracy opposition or pro-democracy movement no longer really exists. They have also completely restructured, for example, how the Legislative Council of Hong Kong is elected. And so the proportion of people who are directly voted for is diminished and pretty much no longer matters anymore. So I think people are really disenfranchised and frankly not very bothered, I would say, about what's happening vis-a-vis the plenum. But I would add a point, Jyoti, that it's quite interesting that there was a mention about Hong Kong in the communique that came out on Thursday, where it kind of celebrated the move by Xi Jinping and the party, quote, to restore order in Hong Kong. So in a way, I think as far as pro-Beijing people in Hong Kong are concerned, and as far as Beijing is concerned, they recovered Hong Kong, which they felt wasn't truly returned to China in the way that they wanted to, because of the fact that you saw all these protests in 2019. And I think they are a lot happier in Beijing right now about bringing Hong Kong back to the fold. But it's a much more difficult question in terms of what people in Hong Kong feel about, given that many are emigrating, people are moving to the UK, people are giving up politics. So it's a very, very different Hong Kong. Even though the return of Hong Kong has been celebrated by this communique. And as Gautam said, I think now Taiwan is the only sort of last remaining domino to fall from the way that they see it.
Right. Ananth, we'll talk about Hong Kong and what this means, and of course, about India. But Ambassador Bambawale, let's cut right to the chase. Now, it's been over a year and a half since Chinese troops, the PLA troops, walked across the line of actual control into Eastern Ladakh. Now, this plenum, which consolidates Xi Jinping's role, can you draw for us a connection perhaps between the two, or what does it mean for India in terms of what Xi Jinping's position is now in China?
So, Jyoti, as we said, and we all agreed on this fact, that the plenum, which has just ended, has further consolidated Xi Jinping's leadership. Now, the trajectory or the nature of Xi Jinping's leadership has been seen over the last few years. As Ananth was just describing, and I will describe it slightly differently, China, or the central government of China under Xi Jinping's leadership, has been aggressive with its own people, whether in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang, and we all know that. It has also been aggressive with its neighboring countries. So not just with India, but also with Taiwan, also with Japan in the Senkaku Islands, with Australia. You have had this attempted economic coercion, and its reactions from Australia is quite obvious to all of us. And in the South China Sea, of course. So under Xi Jinping's leadership, China has become aggressive. She is showing her strength. She's not biding her time anymore. And I think we're going to see more of that. To cut to the chase, as you said, India is going to have a pretty hot winter and summer next year on its borders. And we have to be prepared for that, not just in Eastern Ladakh, but across the entire stretch of the line of actual control between our two countries.
Why do you say that, Ambassador?
Because I say that because after having consolidated his power, Xi Jinping is not going to back off where the India-China LAC is concerned. He's going to press ahead, and that pressing ahead is going to test us. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind about that. But I believe that India is prepared for that kind of testing, not just our military forces, not just our diplomacy, not just the government, but I believe that the people of India stand strongly together, united on this front of defending our territorial integrity, and that is what we will do.
Right. Now, Ananth, this is something, you've just returned to Hong Kong, like you said, after a couple of years. I think the Chinese finally gave you a visa. But just tell me, we have been in India, as you know, completely absorbed by the whole Chinese intrusion question across the LAC. Do the people of, do the Chinese media talk about it? It may not be as central in their imagination as it is in India, obviously, but is there some kind of conversation in the time that, although you've been back very recently, but is there some conversation that's taking place?
Well, not really, Jyoti, and I'd say for two reasons. It's not really high on the agenda. One is, as you said, I think that a lot of the news is dominated by China-US relations. For them, they're obsessed with the US and this virtual summit that's happening soon between Biden and Xi. And the US is kind of the gold standard for them on everything, whether it's the military or where they want to be in terms of global influence. And I think the second reason why they really can't talk about it is because of the obvious fact that if you were to talk about it in detail, it's quite apparent to anyone who was the aggressor in April 2020. It's quite apparent in terms of who's asking for a return to the status quo, which is India. And it does raise a lot of awkward questions for the Chinese narrative on what happened at the LAC. And the Chinese narrative goes like this. It is that India was carrying out constructions, et cetera, and on Chinese territory, and they responded. But they've been so sparing in their information, which is something that I've been writing about from India as well for the last year. And the reason why they're so sparing from their information is they don't have a good story to tell at all, which is the fact that they mobilized two divisions, that they disregarded 4 past bilateral agreements. And it's something that goes against what they're trying to tell the world about the kind of power that they want to be. So for that point of view as well, I think that there's very little that comes out in the media, and the stuff that does comes out kind of goes by the simple narrative of asking for people to be loyal to the military, showcasing the PLA in a very good light, and using the stories of Chinese soldiers on the boundary to garner support for the party and the military. I would just make a point that 3 days before this plenum happened, Xi Jinping conferred these honorific titles on what was being called national ethical role models. Mm-hmm. And one of these ethical role models was Chief Bao, who was the regimental commander in Galwan Valley when the clash happened. And so, and the fact that he went to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping, I think speaks quite a lot in terms of how they've been using the LAC crisis, the Galwan Valley clash, in terms of narrative building as far as the party is concerned. And the reason why they're sparing is, as I just said, they have to be very sparing in information. The videos that most people in China I know have seen are kind of frame it as Indian soldiers crossing into China and the Chinese holding back. But it leaves out the all-important context that the Chinese had intruded before this video had happened, and India was trying to push them back, which no one in China knows about. So Chinese people would see this video of Chinese soldiers standing there, and they obviously would assume that India was intruding because they haven't been given the information and context of how the clash happened, which kind of shows you how effective, especially in the Xi Jinping era, when the spaces for alternative views, where the space for dissent, the space for media to do even a little bit of moderate independent reporting, all of that is really narrowed drastically. When I first came here 10, 12 years ago, it was actually quite vibrant. Gautam would tell you as well, you actually had Chinese media that were doing investigative stories to a limited degree, but all of that's gone now. And I think it's made it a lot easier for them to kind of really massage the narrative. And they've done that as far as India is concerned.
Let me, Jyoti, if you permit me, just let me add one sentence to everything that Ananth has said, and I don't disagree with him at all. What he says is absolutely right. But if you look at it from the public in other countries, nothing the Chinese say will cut ice. China's actions speak much louder than their words. Their words are trying to reduce the salience of certain things, but their actions are speaking volumes. And therefore, nothing that the Chinese will say to the rest of the world, I'm not talking about China itself and the people of China, which is what Ananth was focusing on, but where the rest of the world opinion is concerned, nothing that China says will cut much ice because their actions go diametrically opposite to their words.
But having said that, Ambassador Bambawale, the fact, one of the things that Ananth was talking about, which is that the Chinese media is highly controlled, of course. But my question to you is that shouldn't India be much less ambiguous about what's happening at the LAC or in Eastern Ladakh? I mean, we know that over the last year, if you remember, in August last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that there is nobody on our territory. Now, in the wake of that, isn't there some sort of ambiguity in world capitals, including in China? And shouldn't the Indian government sort of come clean, if you like? It's been over a year and a half. So shouldn't shouldn't the Indian government manage the narrative better?
Look, Jyoti, I tend to agree with the tenor of your question. I don't disagree with it. But at the same time, I believe that the government of India is telling other countries, and other countries are paying attention to what we say, that, the LAC, the concept of the LAC itself is a bit ambiguous, and there comes the ambiguity. But I think that we should be absolutely clear that we have to defend our territorial integrity, and it is China which is the aggressor. As we have been saying so many times, that when you move 2 divisions or 50 to 60,000 troops with armor and artillery, etc., tanks, when you did that in Eastern Ladakh in April or May of 2020, they violated all the bilateral agreements between our two countries, which were signed by their own leaders too, apart from our leaders, on maintaining peace and tranquility in the border areas of India and China. So that's where it all begins.
Right. So, Ananth, tell us a little bit about this land border law that the Chinese have just passed recently. And this is also in connection with the meeting of the regimental commander, who was involved in the Galwan Valley incident. Can you tell us, explain, connect the dots, if you like?
Well, before I come to the border law, if I could just add my own thoughts to the last question, Jyoti. I as a reporter who's been trying to figure out what was happening on the boundary since April 2020, which was when you had people in the Indian government actually saying that this was nothing, that it was all about LAC perceptions. I think that over the last 18 months, I feel that the Indian government really hasn't learned from some of the missteps that it did in terms of transparency and explaining what was happening on the boundary. Just as an example, now that you're looking at what's happening on the eastern sector as well, yesterday on November 11th, you had the MEA rightly saying that what China has been doing in terms of, for example, constructions of villages in disputed areas was something that India will not accept because it's a territory that was illegally occupied. At that very same evening, you had the Chief of Defense Staff saying that there was no Chinese constructions on India's side of the border, which is patently false. So I think that the fact that this messaging has been mixed because of the fact that there's a little bit of, I think, a dilemma in the government about being truthful about what's happening and the enormity of what's happening versus protecting their own image and reputation. I think that national security is something where it's far too important to sort of even have this dilemma. And I think that there's a lot more transparency needed. For example, a simple question which some journalists have asked is, how many patrolling points has India lost access to in the last 18 months? We don't know. Where exactly is the PLA deployed in Eastern Ladakh, and where have they sort of transgressed our perception of the LAC in the eastern sector? We don't know. So I think that it's still an approach of bare minimum of information, and I don't think it helps at all. And I think they should be more forthcoming, and people in India would have a better sense of what exactly China is up to. If I could just add my 2 cents on that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I've often been struck, just as a last point on that, in terms of transparency, we've been reporting on air incursions that the PLA has conducted into Taiwan. And I found it's quite remarkable that every time an incursion happens, the Taiwan government comes out with a map that exactly shows how many incursions happened and where it happened. So people in Taiwan are very aware of what's happening, and they aren't sort of encumbered by the thought that, it makes our air defense systems look bad to allow the Chinese to come in. So I think that's the kind of level of transparency that we should aspire for.
Yes, I think one of the, your point, Ananth, that there is a big difference between the Indian and Chinese media, which is that we do speak truth to power. And in that sense, I mean, you're sitting in Hong Kong, you're in the heart of the debate, as it were, where, there is a big effort to control dissent. But Ambassador Bambawale, Ananth raised this whole point about the villages, the 100-home civilian village now, which the Americans are also talking about. Now, this is supposed to be that this village, or so-called village that the Chinese troops have built, is supposed to be on India's side of the line of actual control in Arunachal Pradesh. So what is your information? What do you think is going on?
No, Jyoti, I don't have much information on this because, as you know, I'm no longer within the government. What I know about this particular thing is not more than what's already available in the public domain. But I think yesterday's remarks by our official spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs makes our position very, very clear. And I'm happy, as Ananth has said, I'm happy that there is no ambiguity in that particular statement.
So, Ananth, can I come back to you and ask you, let's talk a little bit about what's going on inside China. It seems as if the Chinese economy is booming. It's now 70% of the US economy. And yet there are a lot of sort of indications that things are not as hunky-dory as they seem. I mean, Deng Xiaoping's famous slogan, "To get rich is glorious," resonated across the decades. But what's happening now? There seems to be control over, Chinese tycoons like Jack Ma. Can you give us a sense of what's going on?
No, I think I wouldn't say it's really booming, as you put it in the question, only because of the fact that I think there was this huge rebound after the first 3-4 months of the pandemic, which obviously led to this huge shutdown in China from January 2020 to April, May 2020. There's a big boom after that. And in terms of trade, they're still doing great, even though they're so closed off from the rest of the world. I think China and Hong Kong are pretty much the only places, the mainland and Hong Kong are pretty much the only places where they're still following a zero COVID strategy, which is ensuring that they're pretty much zero cases and doing mass sort of testing and lockdowns and the like, while the rest of the world comes back to normal. And that has a big economic cost as well, which you don't quite hear about. But I've heard just from anecdotal evidence and speaking to friends in different provinces of how this huge emphasis on stability, especially with a focus on COVID and the measures that followed, has had a huge cost on small businesses and things that we don't really hear about in the news. And of course, you have a far bigger set of problems in terms of the regulatory moves that Xi Jinping's government has done, which has broadly, to put it in a nutshell, tried to bring to heel, especially big private sector companies that have actually come to accumulate quite a lot of influence and power, whether it's the Alibabas and Tencents on the tech sector, or whether it's even real estate companies. And I think that it seems to me that for Xi Jinping, it's very clear that I think he has a bit of a dim view of the private sector and the space that it should occupy in the Chinese economy. And I think that from the time he took over, there were small steps, since I think he was preoccupied with other things, such as his corruption campaign and taking out political rivals. But I think that repeatedly you've had this refrain that, when China's back is against the wall, when the pandemic happened, it was the state-run companies that stepped in and did what was needed, not the private sector companies. The private sector companies should be serving the party first, serving the country first. That's the kind of refrain that's, that you hear. And I think all of this is now being labeled by Xi Jinping as what he calls common prosperity. And that's the latest buzzword that he's talking about. And the message of that as well, you had the Deng Xiaoping era reading between the lines of this communique as well. They don't really criticize Xi's predecessors, but if you read between the lines, what the communique says is that Mao did this great job in bringing, establishing the People's Republic. Deng did this great job in China's economic growth. But now the country is facing so many challenges, and Xi is doing a great job in fixing those challenges, which is like an implicit criticism of his two predecessors. So I think what he's framing, he obviously wants to have a very different message and image from what his predecessors did. And I think that explains some of his actions, at least. As you said, if earlier it was to get rich, now he's saying, wait a minute, getting rich isn't enough. It has to, the party has to decide how the pie is distributed. And I think that's the trend of how things are going. Sorry,
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that it's all very well to say that, but now the big question is going to be when you start taking these moves. For example, if you take a big call saying that private sector real estate companies can no longer keep on borrowing, the big question is, what is their appetite if growth is going to take a big hit, which it will? And how are they going to do that when they have other political motivations, such as the 20th Party Congress coming in October, when they want to keep the ship sailing until then? So I think the rhetoric is one thing, but it's going to be very difficult for them to put it into practice because they have these political motivations to ensure that the economy still keeps ticking along.
So, let me play devil's advocate, Ambassador Bambawale, and say that to get rich is glorious. That's wonderful. But isn't it time that not just some people got rich, but a larger number of people, or the population as a whole got richer than they were? And this is despite all the surveillance initiatives that you hear about and that you read about. In fact, there's something called social credit, which aims to track every person and company in China and punish violations ranging from the violation of environmental rules to littering to. So while there is this surveillance on the one hand, but if you look at the more positive side, would you say that there has to be a more equitable, growth, economic growth in the country?
Look, having more equitable growth is a desirable end state and a desirable result. No doubt about that. However, the way I look at things is that over the past 40 years, the policy which was unfolded or which was laid out by the former leader Deng Xiaoping was to decentralize economic decision-making, let it flow down from earlier where it used to be controlled totally by Beijing, let it flow down to the provinces, to the cities, to the villages. And in fact, that was what the contract responsibility system, whether in agriculture or in industry, was all about. Decentralizing economic decision-making power. And that led to 40 years of continuous growth in China, explosive growth, 10% per annum for a 4-decade period. Now, what Xi Jinping is doing is the exact reverse of Deng's philosophy and ideology. He is re-centralizing not just political power, he's re-centralizing economic decision-making authority into the state-run enterprises, into the public sector enterprises, and so on. Whether that is going to help, whether that is going to work, whether that is going to lead to high-paced economic growth, I have my doubts, but only time will tell.
And then the last question to you, in the last few years of the Soviet Union, and I'm saying before Perestroika and before Glasnost began, there was a sense amongst the people that, something has to give because there was a lot of control over the general population. Now, in China, would you say, perhaps we're comparing apples and oranges, but is there a sense that this increasing surveillance and control, in fact, I was reading that there are laws now for children below the age of 18 that you cannot watch, TV for more than 3 hours at a time, play online games for more than 3 hours in a week, and only on weekends and Friday night. I mean, this is kind of crazy, isn't it? That Xi Jinping thought, or the government is getting into the private lives of citizens and children. So is there a sense of sort of concern and foreboding that in the years to come, if Mr. Xi Jinping is going to remain, and he is going to stay, I think, at least till the Party Congress and beyond, how is China going to then deal with, say, the big superpower, the US?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, if you look at what's happened in Xinjiang, if you ask anyone in Xinjiang, I think there's an unequivocal answer, which is yes, given that everything that they're going through, that they've gone through in Xinjiang, and the restrictions that are still there. I think it's. I would say it's harder to answer this question to the rest of China. Only because I think it's all about perspective and context. If I can just give you one example to try and answer this very difficult question that you've asked, given that it is a question of a country of 1 billion plus people, and there are still different perspectives that people have. If you look at, for instance, some of the measures that they've taken in this current outbreak they're dealing with of COVID, that I found it quite striking, the level of tolerance and compliance that people have. In the last 2 weeks, I've had friends who have been taken away to centralized quarantine, not because they were positive, not even because they were contacts of positive, but because they were contacts of contacts. They were secondary contacts, and they were just got a knock on the door, and they were taken away for 14 days of centralized quarantine, and they kind of grin and bear it, and they sort of rationalize it by saying that, well, it's for our own good, right? So that's because of years and years of drilling it into people that the party is doing all of this for your own good. I don't think they're at that point yet. For me, you would think that a black swan event such as COVID would be a great barometer of testing those kind of pressure situations or pressure points. And I think the way they've come out of it so far, despite everything that happened in early 2020, and the fact that even though they had such difficult extreme measures, that people are going along with, obviously a huge asterisk is they have no choice but to go along with it. I think kind of tells you that they aren't at that point yet. But the big but that I would add is a lot of this has happened with just 1-2 generations of, as Gautam said, you've had 40 years of growth. You've had people still old enough to remember the times when they didn't have enough to eat. You still have people who remember the times of being kids without footwear going to school, and now they've seen that prosperity. The big question mark that I would leave you with, Jyoti, is if growth tapers off, it cannot continue growing. Anyone will tell you that. Any economist will tell you that. What happens when growth tapers off? Would that level of tolerance to deal with all this other stuff, all this other interference, still stay as high as it is? And I don't think we're at that point yet, but I think that's a very harder question to answer.
But listen, before I let you both go, I have to ask the virtual summit question between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, the US president. Ambassador Bambawale, any thoughts on that?
I'll be very frank, because we're talking about the United States and China. I think China has shown her true face, and I think that the virtual summit is a bad idea on President Biden's side.
But why? Are you worried about a potential G2 again, a US-China?
No, I'm not worried about a potential G2, because I don't think there's any possibility of a G2 coming out of this. I don't see any gains for the United States from such a summit. In fact, it will only dilute the messaging that the United States has been giving over the past few years. And that's why I think it's a bad idea. But I'm not a US national, so I'm free to speak my mind.
Absolutely. And Ananth, what do you think? Do you think do the Chinese see the summit as a concession on the part of the Americans?
Absolutely. I think the very fact that the summit is happening is a win for China, just the fact that it's happening. And I would agree with what Ambassador Bambawale said, where I'm scratching my head in terms of thinking what the pluses are for the US. Just quickly looking back, you've had them sort of agree to let Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou leave Canada. They've withdrawn those charges against her. She went back to China for a hero's welcome, and that became a huge win for the party. In return, you've got this wishy-washy climate deal, which is less than what Obama agreed to with Xi Jinping 7 years ago. And they've rehashed a climate deal, and the US is trying to frame that as a win. And I think all of this is obviously part of the same agreement, which the Chinese said early on, that they won't do a climate deal unless they saw progress in other things. And the US is doing that, giving Xi a virtual summit, agreeing to withdraw the charges on Huawei. What the US gets out of it at the end of the day, I really am not quite sure.
But, I mean, can I just push you, Ambassador? But obviously the Chinese then dealing from a position of strength.
No, the Chinese are dealing from a position of strength, and they do take it as a win. I think as far as the United States is concerned, they're trying to show that they're doing their best to deal with this new aggressive China. And once they don't get anything out of the summit, they're going to use that as proof that there is no point in just talking to China. You've got to take him on.
Well, I'll have to leave it there. Ambassador Gautam Bambawale in Pune and Ananth Krishnan, the Hindu's correspondent in Hong Kong. Thank you so much, Ananth. And glad you're out of your very strict quarantine of 3 weeks. And I will be following you, of course, on your Twitter feed, and you, Ambassador. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.